3 seconds. That's all it took for my whole life to stop making sense. I pulled into my driveway after work, dusty from a long day, already thinking about feeding the horses before the desert sun slipped behind the hills. I walked through the front door, set my lunchbox on the counter, reached for the kitchen faucet like I'd done thousands of times before, and nothing came out. Not a drip. Not even that little cough the pipes sometimes make after sitting all day. Just silence. At first I figured maybe the power had gone out while I was gone, but something deep in my gut told me this was different. I walked outside toward my well, and before I even reached it, I felt my stomach sink. Somebody had filled my only water well with fresh concrete, and it hadn't even finished drying yet. The cement still glistened in the afternoon heat, smooth and wet like it had been poured less than an hour earlier. The strangest part wasn't what they had done. The strangest part was that whoever ordered it honestly believed they could do it and simply move on with their day. I own 7 acres on the edge of the high desert, far enough from town that most people only come out here if they're lost, hunting, or looking to buy land they think will make them rich someday. There are no city water lines running past my gate, no backup connections buried under the road, no emergency valve to turn if something goes wrong. Every drop of water that keeps my house alive comes from one well drilled more than 40 years ago. The old rancher I bought the property from told me the story the day we signed the paperwork. He said he nearly lost the ranch paying to drill that well after 2 dry attempts came up empty. On the 3rd try they finally struck water, and he always joked that he trusted that well more than he trusted most people. Back then I laughed. Years later I understood exactly what he meant. Out here, water isn't a convenience. It's the difference between having a home and having an empty piece of dirt. I never considered myself lucky in the lottery kind of way, but I knew I had a good life. Quiet mornings started with coffee on the porch while the pump quietly hummed somewhere beneath the ground. My horses wandered toward the trough every morning before I even carried their feed buckets. Chickens complained if breakfast was 5 minutes late. I kept a modest vegetable garden that somehow produced tomatoes sweeter than anything I'd ever bought at a grocery store. Every Saturday, I'd make the same slow walk around the property, checking fences, tightening loose wire, clearing tumbleweeds, making sure coyotes hadn't found a new way into the chicken run. It wasn't glamorous, but I slept well every night because everything around me had earned its place through years of steady work. The closest neighbor was almost a mile away, and that's exactly how we all liked it. We waved when we passed each other on the county road, borrowed a tractor or trailer when somebody needed help, then went right back to minding our own business. Nobody cared what truck you drove or how expensive your boots were. Around here, respect mattered more than appearances, and respecting another person's land wasn't just good manners. It was an unwritten rule. That quiet rhythm lasted nearly 15 years before the ranch bordering my western fence sold to a development company. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Land changes hands all the time. Then survey crews showed up. A few weeks later, bulldozers arrived. Soon after that came giant billboards advertising a luxury subdivision called Canyon Ridge Preserve. The signs promised breathtaking desert views, resort-style living, private walking trails, and custom-built homes starting somewhere around a price I'd never even dream of paying. Every brochure showed smiling couples drinking wine beside infinity pools, but none of those glossy pictures showed the clouds of dust drifting across my pasture every afternoon or the constant backup alarms echoing across the valley before sunrise. Still, I told myself construction eventually ends. I wasn't about to become one of those cranky neighbors who complained every time progress showed up. As long as they stayed on their side of the fence, we wouldn't have any problems. That was probably the biggest mistake I made. About 2 weeks after construction started, a man walked down my fence line carrying a clipboard and wearing the cleanest work boots I'd ever seen on a construction site. His name was Grant Mercer. He introduced himself as the project superintendent, smiled like we were already friends, and apologized for disturbing me while I was replacing an old fence post. Just verifying a few property markers, he said politely. Big developments create a mountain of paperwork. That sounded reasonable enough. We talked for a couple of minutes about the weather, how dry the summer had been, and how quickly the subdivision seemed to be growing. Then his questions became a little more specific. He asked how long I'd owned the ranch. Nearly 15 years, I answered. He asked whether I'd ever had survey disputes with neighboring properties. Never once. Then his eyes drifted past me toward the well sitting behind the barn. So that's where your water comes from? he asked. I nodded. Sure does. He stared at the well longer than seemed necessary. Still active. Every day, I answered. Runs this whole place. He made a small note on his clipboard, looked back at me, smiled again, and simply said, good to know. I watched him walk back toward the construction site, and for reasons I couldn't explain, those 3 words kept bouncing around in my head long after he disappeared. Over the next month, little things started feeling off. Survey stakes kept appearing suspiciously close to my fence before disappearing the next day. A pair of construction workers stood near my property one afternoon, pointing toward the well while looking at rolled-up blueprints. Another morning, I caught a pickup parked outside my gate with 2 men taking pictures in my direction. When they noticed me watching, they drove away without saying a word. I mentioned it over coffee to my friend Walter one Saturday morning. He shrugged and said developers always liked knowing what surrounded their projects. Probably nothing, he said. Just keep your paperwork handy. I laughed and changed the subject. Looking back now, I wish I'd taken his advice a little more seriously. The following Monday started like every other workday. I fed the horses before sunrise, checked the garden one last time, locked the front door, climbed into my old pickup, and headed into town without giving the well a second thought. The pump had cycled normally before I left. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. I had absolutely no idea that while I was gone, someone next door was about to make the most expensive decision of their entire project. I pulled back into my driveway a little after 5 that afternoon, more tired than usual because we'd spent the entire day unloading irrigation equipment at work. All I could think about was washing the dust off my hands, pouring a glass of cold water, and getting outside before dark to check on the horses. The silence inside the house caught me first. You don't normally notice the sound of running water until it's gone, but somehow the whole place felt different. I turned the kitchen faucet once, then harder, then all the way. Nothing. I checked the bathroom sink. Nothing. I flushed the toilet. The tank barely trickled before giving up. That's strange, I muttered to myself. My first thought was the breaker panel. Maybe the pump had lost power. I walked into the utility room and opened the electrical box. Every breaker was exactly where it should be. The pressure tank gauge sat flat at 0. My stomach tightened. I grabbed a flashlight even though it was still daylight and headed toward the well. Halfway there I slowed down because I could already see something wasn't right. The steel cap that had protected that well for decades was gone. Gray concrete completely filled the casing from edge to edge, still shiny from the afternoon heat. Thin streams of wet cement had spilled over the sides and hardened across the dirt. Fresh tire tracks surrounded the area. Whoever had done it hadn't even tried to hide it. About 30 yards away, a cement mixer was still idling with its drum slowly turning. I walked straight toward the driver. He climbed down as I approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. Afternoon, he said casually. I looked him dead in the eye. Who told you to pour concrete into my well? His smile disappeared. The site's supervisor, he answered after a second. Said it was an abandoned casing that needed to be permanently sealed before grading. I pointed toward my house. You see those lights? You see that pressure tank? You see those horses standing next to an empty trough? That isn't an abandoned well. That's the only water source for everything you see. The driver looked genuinely uncomfortable. He glanced back toward the construction site, then back at me. Sir, I'm sorry. I just pour where the work order tells me. I believed him. He wasn't trying to argue. He honestly thought he had completed another routine job. I thanked him for being honest, pulled out my phone, and started recording everything. I filmed the fresh concrete from every angle. I recorded the truck number, the company logo, the license plate, the wet slurry running down the casing, the electrical conduit that had been pulled aside, the damaged wiring, even the footprints leading away from the well. Then I called the number Bryce, or rather Grant Mercer, had given me weeks earlier. He answered on the second ring, sounding annoyed, like I'd interrupted an important meeting. Grant speaking. You need to explain why your crew just filled my water well with concrete. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause, a calculating one. Right, he finally said. That well was listed inside the revised setback area. We were informed it wasn't active. I took a slow breath. You were informed wrong. It's active every single day. Another pause. Well, he replied in the most dismissive voice I'd heard in years. Then I guess you'll need to drill another one. For a second I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Excuse me. Look, these things happen during construction. We'll sort it out eventually. You filled a permitted water well on my property. He sighed loudly. Sir, I've got an entire subdivision to manage. If you want to file a complaint, call the office tomorrow. Then he hung up. I stood there staring at my phone, feeling something inside me change. Until that moment I was angry. After that phone call I became focused. Anger makes people do stupid things. Focus wins cases. I climbed into my truck and drove straight into town without saying another word to anyone. My attorney, Rebecca Collins, had helped me years earlier when I purchased the ranch and handled every piece of property paperwork since then. When I walked into her office carrying nothing but my phone, she immediately knew something was wrong. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said. Worse, I answered, handing her the phone. She watched the video without interrupting. Then she watched it again. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and asked one simple question. When was this recorded? Less than an hour ago. She nodded slowly. Good. Fresh evidence. She opened a filing cabinet and started pulling folders with my name on them. Original property survey. Well drilling records from more than 40 years earlier. Pump installation permits. Electrical inspection reports. State groundwater registration. County water rights documentation. Every piece of paper that proved the well wasn't just legal, it was fully protected. She spread everything across the conference table like puzzle pieces. Grant Mercer just made the most expensive mistake of his career, she said calmly. This isn't simply vandalism. Water rights out here are treated very seriously. She picked up the phone and called the County Water Resources Division. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't make emotional speeches. She simply stated the facts. Active domestic well, legally permitted, intentionally sealed with concrete by adjacent development contractor. Immediate inspection requested. Whoever answered must have recognized how serious that was because within 2 hours, 3 county vehicles rolled onto my property. One inspector specialized in groundwater systems. Another handled construction compliance. The third represented environmental protection. None of them wasted time talking. They walked straight to the well carrying cameras, measuring equipment, permit maps, and inspection binders. The groundwater inspector crouched beside the casing, scraped away a little of the still soft concrete, and looked toward the others. Fresh pour, he said. Probably completed this afternoon. They traced the electrical conduit, checked the pump permit numbers, compared GPS coordinates against county survey records, verified the registered location of the well, and reviewed every document Rebecca had already laid out on the hood of her SUV. 40 minutes later, the lead inspector closed his notebook. This is an active permitted domestic water source. Just then, Grant Mercer pulled into my driveway in a white company pickup, climbing out before the truck had fully stopped. What's going on here? He demanded. The inspector looked up calmly. Your project destroyed an active water well. Grant immediately pointed toward the concrete subcontractor. They must have misunderstood the instructions. The inspector didn't even blink. Subcontractors operate under your permit. It was an honest mistake. That doesn't change the violation. Grant looked at me. We'll compensate him. The inspector interrupted before I could answer. This is no longer a private dispute. He reached into his truck and pulled out a bright red stop work notice. Within minutes, inspectors were posting identical notices across the construction site. Excavators shut down where they sat. Concrete crews climbed out of half-finished foundations. Delivery trucks arriving at the entrance were turned around without unloading. Workers stood in small groups trying to figure out what had happened, while supervisors scrambled to make phone calls. I quietly watched from my fence as the same project that had seemed unstoppable that morning came to a complete standstill before sunset. Then things became even worse for the developer. Since inspectors were already on site, they expanded their review. They discovered grading outside approved boundaries, incomplete erosion controls, drainage violations, and several permit discrepancies that probably would have gone unnoticed for months if nobody had buried my well. One violation led to another, and another after that. By the end of the evening, the project wasn't just shut down because of my water well anymore. The county had opened a full compliance investigation. Grant walked toward me one last time as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. His confidence was gone. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I looked at Rebecca. She gave a slight shake of her head. I turned back toward him. You had your chance to talk, I said. That was when you told me to drill another well. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove home, leaving him standing there in the dust while behind him an entire luxury subdivision sat silent, and the concrete inside my old well still hadn't finished curing. The next few weeks moved a lot slower than that first afternoon, but in some ways they hurt the company even more. Every day their equipment sat behind those red county notices was another day subcontractors weren't getting paid, buyers were calling for updates, investors were asking uncomfortable questions, and deadlines kept slipping farther away. Meanwhile, I was hauling temporary water to keep my animals alive, and every trip reminded me why none of this should have happened in the first place. I wasn't asking for luxury. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I simply expected people to leave my property alone. The county's investigation wrapped up surprisingly fast because, as one inspector told me, the facts aren't complicated when somebody leaves fresh concrete inside the evidence. That sentence still makes me smile. Their final report concluded that my well had been an active, legally permitted domestic water source protected under state regulations and that it had been intentionally sealed without authorization. Whether it happened because of negligence, arrogance, or somebody trying to save time didn't really matter anymore. Responsibility stayed with the developer. A few days later, Evelyn called me into her office with a stack of settlement documents almost an inch thick. High Ridge Development had agreed to fund the drilling of a brand new well at no cost to me, not just replacing what I'd lost, but improving it. The county required the new well to be drilled deeper into a more reliable aquifer, install an entirely new pump system, upgraded electrical service, a larger pressure tank, new filtration equipment, complete water quality testing, and restoration of the disturbed area around the original site. On top of that came substantial regulatory fines, engineering review costs, inspection fees, and the suspension of their grading permit for the remainder of the construction season. That single decision, made on one hot afternoon, ended up delaying dozens of planned homes. A week later, I drove past the entrance out of curiosity. The giant sales banners were still standing, but there weren't nearly as many trucks going in and out anymore. The place that had once sounded like a small city under construction had become strangely quiet. I never saw Bryce again. Nobody officially told me what happened to him, but one morning his company pickup disappeared from the job site, and another superintendent showed up wearing a hard hat instead of expensive sunglasses. Sometimes silence tells you everything you need to know. About a month later, the drilling crew arrived at my place before sunrise. Those men treated my property with a level of respect I'd almost forgotten existed. Before they moved a single piece of equipment, they walked the site with me, explained every step, marked utility lines twice, and asked permission before crossing any section of my land. Funny how professionals who actually know what they're doing don't mind taking an extra 10 minutes to do things the right way. They drilled deeper than the original well had ever gone, nearly another 100 feet before striking an even stronger water source. I still remember the driller grinning beneath his dusty hat when the water started flowing. "Looks like you just got yourself an upgrade," he said. He wasn't kidding. The new system produced more water than the old one ever had. The pressure inside the house was stronger, the water tested cleaner, and even the garden seemed happier that summer. Every now and then I'd catch myself standing on the porch listening for the gentle hum of the new pump cycling on, and instead of feeling angry, I just feel grateful that one reckless decision hadn't managed to take away the life I'd built out there. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if I feel like I won. Honestly, I don't think that's the right word. Winning would have been coming home that afternoon and finding my well exactly where I left it. Winning would have been never having to watch my horses wait beside empty water troughs or wonder how I was going to get through the next few days. What happened instead was accountability, and there's a difference. The law didn't punish them because I yelled the loudest. It didn't side with me because I was the little guy. It sided with facts, permits, records, photographs. I'm genuinely curious where people draw that line. And if you enjoy true-style stories about property disputes, legal battles, and everyday people standing their ground the right way, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that respecting another person's property should never be optional. You never know. The next story might remind all of us that the smallest decision can sometimes bring down the biggest project.